Hey there, if you haven't met each other, my name is Adityan and welcome to my YouTube channel. In my channel, I try to share stuff that I find interesting and educational in the hope that others find it useful. And in this video, we're going to talk about something known as debt. So what was your response when you heard the word debt right now? Maybe you had one of these instinctive responses. Maybe it was one of these. Maybe you thought debt, I don't know how it's relevant for me. Or maybe you thought debt, that's something that I would never get into. Or if you're already in debt, one of the common responses, I want to get out of this as soon as possible. And that is the kind of responses that I typically get when I talk about this concept to my friends. And if you notice, all of them are an emotional response to this word debt. But this thing called as debt, like anything else related to money, is an entirely man-made fictional concept. And these fictional concepts often operate under their own specific set of rules. If we understand those rules, then we can learn to play the game really, really well. We can learn to play them logically instead of emotionally. It's super important because I found that it's often very counterproductive to play these games of money with your emotions and the natural human tendencies. So the goal of this video is to kind of demystify debt, decouple our emotional reactions to debt, then understand the rules of debt, and finally play the game of debt so that we can leverage it and use it to build wealth in our financial journey. If you're interested in something like this, hop on, let's go learn to play the game of debt. Before we do that, 2 disclaimers. Number 1, obviously I'm not a financial advisor. Don't purely base your decisions on what I say here. Do your own research before taking any major financial decision. Number 2, the things that I'm going to say are not based on some financial books or rigorous scientific studies. These are some really simple rule of thumbs, hacks, and heuristics that I've developed over the years, and I'm sharing it here in the hope that others might find it useful. It might be really simple or trivial for some, but like my professor used to say, the simplest models are often the most elegant and useful ones. Alrighty, with that long introduction behind, now we can truly start. So the video is going to be split up like this. So first off, we are going to build a simple mental model for debt. Once we do that, we'll have a common understanding. And then we can talk about how to use debt to buy assets and how to use debt to buy liabilities. So these are the leveraging tools that we can use to build our wealth. And finally, we'll kind of sum this all up. So first off, understanding debt. So let's try to build a simple mental model for this. So the many complicated and technical definitions for understanding debt, but I try to imagine debt in its most simplest form like this. So imagine there's the young, idealistic, energetic version of you right now in time. And then there is the old, sophisticated you, some arbitrary time in the future. And now what you're going to do is you're going to take a time machine and you're going to travel forward in time. So once you reach there, you're going to try to convince the old version of you to give you some money. You may convince him by telling some things like this. Hey, look, old Adi, give me some money right now. And I'm going to go back in time and use that smartly. And I'm going to build wealth out of it. So that's essentially debt. You make a contract with your future self. You get money right now, but your future self is supposed to pay back that money. So the hope is that you will use that money smartly right now and hopefully grow it to much more than what you borrowed at a future point in time. Obviously, we don't have time machines, or at least not yet. So we have to rely on certain gatekeepers to give us this access to the time machine. And traditionally, the gatekeepers of these time machines are often financial institutions like bank or mortgage providers and so on. So obviously, they don't want to do it for free. They are usually like, hey, give us a percentage of the money that you brought back. And that's the kind of the penalty that you pay to do this time traveling. And usually this percentage is known as interest rate, mortgage rate, and then several other names. All right, now we have all the components needed to build a mental model for debt. So now I want to quickly put this all together and highlight the crucial parts. So there are 3 main parts. Number 1, which is the amount of money that you bring back from your future self. Number 2, as we talked earlier, there are certain gatekeepers that allow you to do this time traveling and you need to pay a kickback for them. And this kickback is often called as interest rate, which is a portion of the amount that you bring back. And finally, number 3, this is the time period between your current self and the future self with whom you made the contract is. As we go through the video, we'll keep revisiting this model, especially those 3 parts to make sense of when to use debt and how to use debt. Okay, now let's move on to the next section. So by using this concept of debt, we were able to get some money for our present self. And obviously we need to use this money somehow smartly to build wealth. We can do this 2 ways. One, we can use this to buy something known as assets. So what are assets? Just a quick definition. Assets are anything that over time increases in its value. So typical examples of assets are stocks, real estate, commodities, gold. There are some key things that I want to highlight about assets. Number one, because of the nature of compounding, the assets usually grow exponentially over time. They don't grow linearly, they grow exponentially. This is very, very important. We'll come back later. And the second point is different assets have different growth rates, and this growth rate will often determine how quickly the asset grows. This is also important because, like I told earlier, the growth of an asset is often exponential or not linear, and any small difference in the asset growth rate will have like tremendous impact on the differences over a long period of time. All right, now let's put together what we learned about assets with what we learned about debt earlier and kind of put this all together. So let's say now you've traveled forward in time, made a contract with yourself and got some debt, and you're paying some interest rate for this debt, and you're now buying assets with the debt that you just got. And now a couple of interesting things could start happening based on the math involved here. And let's take a look at one scenario. That scenario is when your asset growth rate is higher than the interest rate that you pay. For example, let's say the asset growth rate is 8% per annum and your interest rate is 1% per annum. So what would have happened now? Let's say you invested the money that you got as debt in the assets. Normally it would have grown at 8% year over year. And for the reason that I mentioned earlier, it's compounding, so it grows exponentially. So that's how it would have looked. So you're looking at that green dotted line there. So your asset would have grown year over year exponentially, and you would have increased in value. But since now you have an interest rate penalty that you have to pay, it is not going to grow at 8%, but it is going to grow at 8 minus 1, which is 7. So your assets are going to grow at 7% year over year. And at the end, you're going to have some money. So not as good as what you would have got with 8%, but still you're going to end up making money. And now let's see things from your future self's perspective. He gave you some money, you did some smart decisions, and now you're giving him more money than what he initially gave you. So obviously he's going to be happy. And that is how you can use debt to buy assets, leverage it, and build wealth. All this might seem very trivial and obvious when I put it out like that, but I still think this model is very powerful. It helps us to answer some questions. These are some of the questions that I see repeatedly come up with the discussions with my friends. Number one, should I get into debt? The answer, in my opinion, is if you are eligible, if you can afford it, and if you're fairly certain about the stability of the asset growth rate and the interest rate over a long period of time, do it. And the second question, how long should you have the debt for? And the answer to this is very interesting and counterintuitive than what people usually think. You need to hold it as long as possible. Why? Just look at the graph. Because of the way the compounding works here, the longer that you hold your debt for, the better your returns are going to be. But what I find often happening is that when my friends get a really, really good deal, by good deal I mean they get an asset growth rate which is fairly higher than the interest rate, and they know that this is stable over a long period of time, they still choose to pay off this loan as soon as possible. By doing that, you're kind of cutting off the compounding returns that you get. You're much better off saving that money and kind of reinvesting elsewhere. Debt by in itself is not something that you need to be proud of or be ashamed that you have it. It's just a financial tool, and we need to use it as a tool and not be too emotionally attached to it. Okay, enough talking about that scenario. Let's move on to another scenario where your interest rate is greater than the asset growth rate. In this case, although you might be eligible for debt, taking debt and investing in such an asset is kind of counterproductive. Example, let's say the interest rate is 7% and your asset growth rate is just 4%. So effectively your assets are going to grow at minus 3%, which is not what you want. Okay, that was a lot of information for assets and debts. So let's kind of sum it up all together now with those three models that we initially talked about. Let's take it one at a time. Let's actually start with two. So in my opinion, you can use debt to invest in assets when your asset growth rate is greater than the interest rate and you're fairly certain about the stability of this over a long period of time. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Point 3, the debt period. Given the previous assumption that you got a really good deal, then try to extend the debt period as long as possible. This is a bit counterintuitive, but this is true because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Finally, let's move on to the point 1, how much money or how much debt to take. This is a slightly tricky one to answer. Based on the math before, if you're 100% certain about the asset growth rate and the interest rate, then you might want to get as much debt as you can afford, right? But obviously in life, nothing is 100% certain. So you want to give a certain safety there. So in the finance world, this is called as margin of error. So how much uncertain are you about those interest rates and the growth rate over a long period of time? So you might want to account that, and based on how much margin of error that you can personally afford, you want to take a loan that. I know this was very abstract, but it might get a little too complicated for this video. Maybe I'll cover that in one of my upcoming videos. That's it about assets and debts. I hope it gives you some really simple mental models to work with when you're thinking about in your own financial journey. Now let's move on to the next section, which is about using debt to buy liabilities. This is a personal favorite hack of mine. I don't see this being discussed often in the financial world. I'll try to keep this fairly short. For some definitions, what are liabilities? Liabilities are any things that go down in value over time. For example, think of the car that you buy. It's not going to go up in value, right? So it's going to go down in value. Or think about the electronic gadgets that you buy. So they go down in value. So liabilities are opposites to the assets that we talked about earlier. And within liabilities, I kind of categorize them into two parts. One is necessities and one is luxuries. Luxuries are usually things that I don't need for my day-to-day living. For example, gaming console, fancy TV, or new gadgets. Whereas necessities are the ones that I need for my everyday life. For example, groceries. The reason I categorize it like this is that I would never use debt to buy luxuries, but I might think of using debt to buy necessities. And now you may ask, why buy some necessities like groceries with debt? I admit it might sound a little bit weird, but this is one of my personal favorite financial hacks, and I don't see this being discussed often, so let me explain. The reason that you want to do this is because anyway you're going to spend that money on the necessities, so you might as well defer the payment for later. So imagine somebody is willing to give you debt to buy those necessities at a 0% interest rate, so you can defer the payment for some time and later, and you can use that money right now to buy some assets and grow your wealth. I know that might sound a little too abstract and still confusing, so let me show you some examples. So the first example is buying groceries from Amazon. So what I do is when I want to buy some groceries like oats, peanut butter and the regular stuff, I try to batch them. And once you hit the €100 mark, Amazon offers this opportunity where you can split your purchase into 3 monthly payments of 0% APR. Or other way to think about this, you're taking a debt of a duration for 3 months at 0% interest rate. Or for example, when I flew to my home country, India, about a year ago, I had to pay for the flight ticket. And I again found like a sweet deal where I could kind of defer this payment for the next 2 years at 0% interest rate. So essentially I got like a 2-year debt for this €700, and I pay at a 0% interest. Or the final example is when I bought this apartment, I had to renovate it and I had to buy a bunch of stuff from IKEA. And again, there I kind of deferred the payment for 2 years at 0% interest rate. So what I'm doing here is that I'm buying my necessities with debt, and then whatever money that I would have put into these necessities, I'm going to reinvest them into assets, and they're going to grow in value. So when you think about it, you're actually making money. Okay, that was a lot of information to kind of sum up the liabilities and debt section. So first off, never ever buy luxuries with debt, because it's a slippery slope. Once you start doing that, you end up somewhere else. So I would buy only necessities with debt. And within that, I would use this kind of rule of thumbs personally for me. So let's start with 2, the interest rate. I do this only when I get 0% APR or 0% interest rate on the debt for my necessities. And let's move to number 3. What is the time duration that you want the debt for? Again, for the reasons mentioned earlier, I try to elongate this period as long as possible. And number 1, how much money? I try to do this whenever and wherever possible when I'm buying necessities. That's it. So now let's kind of put everything together and do a quick summary of what we saw in this video so far. Okay, number 1, debt, like any other things related to money, is a man-made concept, and it operates under its own set of rules. If we understand those rules well, we can use it as a tool, we can leverage it and use it in our wealth building journey. Number 2, try not to get too emotionally attached with the concept of debt, because that's often counterproductive or detriment to the way you need to operate with debt. And then you can primarily use debt to do 2 things. You can either buy assets or liabilities. But within assets, if you buy the right kind of assets, then you can accelerate your wealth building journey. And again, within liabilities, there's something called as necessities, and you can do some financial hacking where you can use debt to buy your necessities, and that'll also help in your wealth building journey. Okay, that's it. That's the end of the video, and that's all about debt. I hope you found this useful. If there's any feedback, please let me know. Was the video too long, too short, useful, not so useful? Any feedback will help me improve for the upcoming videos. If you did find this helpful, the easiest way to support this channel is by liking, commenting, or subscribing to this channel. That kind of helps for people who are looking for such information to discover this specific video. The main reason that I'm making these YouTube videos is because I want to share information that I wish I knew when I was younger. So there's nothing to sell here, no sales pitch, or there's no monetary angle to all of this. And that's a wrap. Thanks for sticking along. Have a nice day, and adios from Adi.